Hello, everybody. Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It is September 20th, 2020. We're in library room 662 at TMU. I have my friends in the building, in the room with me, and friends online, and those watching it after the fact. So did you guys want to talk about that? So you guys are discussing, as a little review, the nature of I guess, encouragement in the learning process and social support. And on one end, you're giving an example of a pianist who was harshly criticized the entire time, but then became one of the world's best pianists. And then you're giving an example of students that went to UT, and those students, they felt it was unjustifiably challenging in a way that would make them never want to go there again.
Well, some of them, yes, that's true.
Mm-hmm. I found that, yeah, sometimes, speaking to a university context, they can make it more difficult than it needs to be, just because they want the students when they go elsewhere to, any graduates kind of represent that university. So they want those graduates to, I don't know, have high quality. Excuse me. I found that Lakehead University was very difficult compared to TMU. Even when you look at the minimum requirements to stay in the program, it's 10% higher at Lakehead, which is a big difference. If you need a 70 versus a GPA of 1.67, that's a big difference.
Well, what I find interesting as well is I looked at the entry requirements for the University of Toronto, St. George, for a specific program. The requirements for their satellite campuses, one in Mississauga and Scarborough, are 10% less than the campus. I find that rather strange, considering that at the end of the day, all students from those campuses will end up with the exact same degree. And are supposedly going to be taught at the same level. So I wonder why there is a discrepancy between the St. George campus and the satellite ones.
Yeah, it's that's a management issue. I'm not 100% sure why they would be doing that. I guess it could be just a population thing. They want to ensure that they fill the seats, and so if they had it that much higher, they just wouldn't have the students that would be able to go or willing to go. I don't think everybody wants to go to those campuses. They usually want to go downtown, the St. George campus. There's something to be said about encouragement and support as a motivational principle for learning, and then how to give feedback and or criticism, to guide the learning process. Because if the person, what is the motivating principle? Is it aversion, I'm avoiding pain? Or am I going towards something? I'm attracted to a reward, right? And what degree of choice do I have in this? If I'm being coerced to do it, there is no other way. If you're a kid and your parents are just forcing you, then you don't really have a choice. So, I think there's certain variables that will definitely influence the outcome of this kind of stuff. But I don't know, I kind of err on the side of the intrinsic motivation of the individual is really important, what they want to do. And so determining what moves them is the first step, why are you doing this in the first place? And in my experience, working with people, and the other day I motivated some students to do a project on Trump. And they didn't really know very much about it because they're young and they just don't watch the news, right? And so I connected what's going on in the United States to just a post-World War II crisis, in the sense that there's now problems with democracy being overthrown through charismatic leaders, in the same way that Hitler was voted in power, right, with his charisma. And and they were motivated. I was able to get them to want to do it, but I don't know. I'm kind of against a authoritarian, coercive approach towards things. You guys wouldn't want to be here if I was an asshole to you, or if I was disrespectful or made fun of you, you just like be like, oh, this doesn't feel good. Like I have no reason to be there, you know? And like certain properties of groups, like why, like going outside of just an individual's motivation towards an activity, but like group cohesiveness. Like what is it that makes a group stay together, you know?
Well, I think it's important to have a leader that is respected, because if the people under that leader don't respect said leader, I don't think they would want to be there. I think respect is a fundamental thing for me in groups. If there is a leader there, I think it's quite important.
Yeah, I agree with you too. Like I respect people. And what does it mean to be a leader? Like someone who's in a position.
Someone that knows more than the rest of the group and is there as a kind of a beacon of knowledge, like yourself, for example.
Sure. Yeah. And even take something that I'm not that person. Like if we all went to like, there's like kite surfing. I'm not very good at it. I'm assuming no one else is really good at it. So if we went there together, we'd all be a novice, you know, and we would want to see this person who's the leader demonstrate and explain things, like have a sense of expertise with it. Right. So yeah. Okay. So for today, I was thinking about the question you posed 2 weeks ago, and that is the motivation for my continuation of our talk on that. So the question was basically like, can you, and part of the purpose of this kind of seminar, this long series of seminars, is to not necessarily just for me to explain the right answer. It's more of like a think tank in the sense that I'm going through certain problems and I'm demonstrating how to think about those problems, right? So and sometimes I might branch out and not fully really know what to say, but then it's the method of approaching that lack of knowledge and then learning to explore it, right? Because a lecture is more like because I actually don't know what I'm talking about 90% of the time I walk in here, and I just do it on the spot. Because it's more of a practice of just how to think about things, right? And that goes core to what I feel it means to be philosophical, and at the same time, why that's useful for us. Like, why does it matter being philosophical? Like, who cares? Like, philosophy is in that right there, and my life is over here. You know, like I have responsibilities in life, and that's what it's about. And so I'm trying to demonstrate what it means to like think out loud, you know? And so you brought up a lack of I wasn't as clear in one of my arguments I made 2 weeks ago. And the argument was about what are like the next steps for humanity in some ways. And I was discussing an anthropological perspective of how Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons most likely mated, and they made their current hominin like species, us. And from there, we, collected into groups, and then we had the tool stage that current chimpanzees are in. And civilization kind of built from there, right? And so my response was that there's a plateau in human development, or evolution, you could say, right? Not in the individual, but the species in itself. And that is the cause of all the problems we have right now. That's kind of what I was saying, right? It's like a brief summary. So we have the individual, right? And then there's like the individual with other people. And so the problem really comes down to us evolving the point of consciousness that we have today, right? We can be aware of ourselves. And so this self-awareness has its own issues. The lack of self-awareness and the awareness of it. And that's where we can get like some bias or distorted view. There's certain problems that can come in my relationship with myself, right? And that's just a function of consciousness. So one issue could be like depression. That's a relationship with myself. Another one would be like narcissism. So problems with self, right? Another one could be like substance use disorder. And we can go through the list of psychological issues in the DSM or whatever. And so the solution to this, the solution is the same for both of these things. So this is one problem. Another problem would be me being conscious of others. So this is like the other, like a generalized other. And then from there, you can extrapolate to like many others, right? So like groups or like the group. And so in this, the awareness of the other, so again, I'm just conscious of the other, that has its own problems. So on one sense, there's the self-awareness or the mind component of this, but then on the other sense, there's also like a physical component. And in the physical sense, that's where you get like violence and other things that can happen, right? Physically. Mental side, you know, there could be problems in this, and that's so some other issues that happen over here are like biases, racism, you know, prejudice, things like that, you know, biases like the fundamental attribution error. Like, yeah, so this is like social stuff. But then there's also like political stuff. And you can have like Trumpism, you know, versus like a healthy democracy. You have like tyranny and dictatorship. And there's other things. There's organizational problems like the workplace. I guess that's not necessarily political, but workplace. Yeah. Maybe that has to be in its own category of the economy. It doesn't really matter. Because of humans, yes.
Sorry, can I interrupt for a minute? So I think that you mentioned one category social, one category political. Also, you mentioned the categories of physical and mental. So one way to categorize could be to categorize in the terms of physical, mental, and emotional. So a lot of the political things could go into mental, the way someone views the world, but some of it goes to emotional. They just feels in a certain way. So that could be one way to categorize. Although social, political could be another way. So I've seen some people categorizing things in the sense of mental, physical, and emotional, and that's a pretty comprehensive like categories to use. A lot of things could fit into these categories.
They're not 100% mutually exclusive. There's going to be some overlap. Like the Venn diagrams might be like this, you know? Certain things might be strictly physical, but there's going to be a mental component or like an attitude or belief element of that. It might just be simply reactive, like someone's driving and they weren't thinking about it and they get into an accident, and that's a physical issue.
And if you notice, you intersected 3 circles. Out of 3 intersecting circles, if you count, there would be 7 things that are created now. So you get 7 from 3. That's interesting if you count. Yeah.
That's cool. So, okay. So what I'm trying to say is that fundamentally, at the very core level of human beings just being a conscious being, very conscious to this degree, but there's certain limitations in the degree of consciousness that we have, right? And those limitations would be our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with other people at a fundamental level. And so you say, well, okay, we do. Like all of these problems come with the self. All of these problems come with our relationship with others and groups. It can be manifested in different ways and combinations of beliefs or the way I think about things, right? And then physical stuff like war and violence and that kind of stuff, right? So what do we do? And well, or you know the answer. It's always the same answer. But I'm approaching it from different ways to show and demonstrate why this is, I believe, the best way to do it. Maybe my specific execution of this is not, there could be better people that can do better than me, but I'm at least trying, right? And so, okay, so what we have is one single individual, okay? We're gonna learn to counterbalance our own personal issues of the fact that we are conscious. And that when you do critical thinking, right? We understand reason, that's part of it. But then there's also practices and habits that we do through, we talk about this, self-awareness, meditation is one way to do that, and other things. And then we do it in a group context, right? And so this is just I'm just being very clear about the argument now that I wasn't as clear as last time because I had a minute to think about it. And so, yeah. And so basically something, just again, it's the same thing I discussed before, but it's just a group of people that are actively practicing their habits, but then also from a social cultural level, they're instilling values of, in the sense of saying, that is good. You are doing good here, right? You get praise and reward, going back to the motivational stuff, which is the function of being socialized, that whatever it is you are doing is a good thing, right? This is another reason why at a fundamental level, these problems occur. And then the response is some kind of institution or organization that just facilitates or mitigates what would necessarily cancel out the possibility of those problems occurring, or at least reduce them, right? And that's what I just throw the title philosophy study on that for now, but it's really just like an exercise gym to prevent, like, I don't know, not be, like falling over in old age and breaking your hip. If you work out and you're in good shape, the probability of that happening is maybe less. You can still be reckless and hurt yourself, but if you're strong, it's less likely to occur, right? And so this is a exercise kind of, I don't know, paradigm or workout schedule to prevent things like this happening. So we say, okay, well, how does this work for things like Trumpism, right? Well, Trumpism is a reflection of the people that live in the United States, right? That, what was it, 45 or 6% of people would vote for Trump right now? Are you serious? Okay, for what reason, right? Like, it could be a value thing where they just don't care about his 4 criminal charges. They don't care about democracy that much, which is kind of a problem in itself. That's like the Toronto Blue Jays losing the game, but then beating up all of the other team and then physically just changing the scoreboard and being like, there, we won. Not many people are going to want to play sports with that team anymore if they always win. Like, it's not a fair game, right? And so democracy is supposed to be a fair game approach to power and politics. And so if it was the case that, like, a lot of the red states are very Christian, and the stuff that I'm talking about is not really taught at all in religious groups. It's contrary to philosophy. If critical thinking and these social psychological, there's the awareness of the thing, but then there's the training and practice to counterbalance it. So for example, like if we were going to do a training module on the bystander effect, how would you do that? So first of all, what's the bystander effect? Do you know?
Oh, yeah.
Is that when the more people there are, the less likely a resolution will come into fruition, or?
Yes, the higher the frequency or the higher the population of individuals that has seen an emergency or something like that, the less likelihood any single individual will respond to it. It's like a diffusion of responsibility, right? And so if we're like, okay, we have a society of people and we know that there's a natural tendency for this, just like as humans, you can suffer damage from the sun, right? So you can either stay out of the sun or put on sunscreen that has protection from UV rays, right? So we have some mitigating way to do that. And if someone gives you sunscreen, like for example, there was a guy at work, I don't know if I talked about this, you guys, but there's a dude at work and I was using a grinder a few weeks ago and I was grinding this metal mesh and I'm wearing safety glasses, right? Because the little pieces of metal can go in, like literally go inside your eye. Like that's like of things that are bad in that situation. That's one of the worst things that can happen. It hurts when it hits your skin, but it's like you can be tough with that. You can be a little tough with, which means you just tolerate it. And so there was literally like maybe 6 feet of it left. I was working and I was like, I'm done. I have to go live a different life now. The carpenter time for me is very limited, but I do it because it's fun. It's like playing with Lego. And I gave him the tools. Like, can you do this? He's like, yes. Motivation's there, right? I was like, I don't know if I talked about the safety glasses, but I assumed that was part of the can you do this thing. Because I talk about safety all the time at work. Like one of the main things is my entry into that role to make more than minimum wage while I'm at school was to not destroy my body and get injured, right? So I'm like very safety keen to the point where it irritates people sometimes, you know? And I leave and I don't talk to the guys. Then the next day I call the project manager and I'm like, hey, how'd it go yesterday? He's like, as soon as you left, within like 5 minutes or less, the other guy had to leave. Did I tell you guys the story? Yeah. I told someone the story. I don't know if it was. Tell you the story? No? Okay. This is a new story for you. This is a beautiful thing. And I was like, what happened? He's like, he got a piece of metal in it. He had to go to the hospital. They had to physically pull it out of his eye. And now he's off work for a couple of days. And he's frustrated because as the project manager, he's trying to just get off. You need like 4 people in the boat to properly sail the boat. If you lose one person, then it's not going to function that well, right? And so he's frustrated now because he's down one man, right? And then the project manager is, I love him like a dad, he's great. He's super frustrated, right? And he's trying to express his frustration in the most respectful way he can. But he's like, you know, blank, 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 derogatory terms. He's like, I am so frustrated translating because his glasses were around his neck. He has like a little lanyard and they were just sitting right there. So, yes. What was I talking about the story for? There's a reason. Mitigating things, yes. And so we could use colorful language to describe a person that if you give them the sunscreen, you're like, put this on, right? Like my stepfather used to tan in the backyard all the time, and I got cancer on his ear. He tanned every day, like he was like brown. He's like a Ukrainian guy, but he's like brown because he tanned every day. That's what he did, you know. And then eventually he got sun cancer. They cut a piece of his ear off, and it was fine, skin cancer. And yeah, so part of the thing is that you can have the awareness of the thing. Someone can tell you, but then you can be autonomous, and that's equivalent. Like if we were going to say that stupidity had any meaning, it's really just when you decide to do the bad thing. When you're like, no, I'm going to drive into oncoming traffic. I just want to see what happens.
That's interesting because you were talking about Trumpism, but also, and then sort of like, how would this apply to Trumpism and supporters of Trump?
Yeah, so there's going to be different reasons why people would vote for Trump, right? One can be economically. That the most important, if you have a lot of money and you feel your money, and that's the most important thing to you, and other things don't matter, like abortion laws, you don't really care. But as long as your money is safe and the government's not spending it on things that you don't agree with, right? Then that might be the only thing that matters to you. And yeah, and so again, there's some fundamental issues with the way that people's attitudes and their values can be structured. And part of that is what we would be doing with groups like this, right? Is to talk about the nature of value, what is most important, and to kind of flush that out. Because even if you're paying taxes, it's not that someone's literally stealing from you and they're taking that money and spending it on like drugs or buying their own car that's nicer than yours. That money is going towards like social programs to ensure that, or like making the roads better, assuming that our government's not corrupt and spending the money on like, you know, Putin's palace, for example.
Or to support what you're saying, like that's basically the difference between third world countries and first world countries. There is tax, and the tax is put into things that makes the first world countries first world countries. So just to support of like taxes are not completely useless.
Mm-hmm. It's depending on how it's being used.
Exactly.
And we can talk about that, you know, the way to, like, is it just, or is it most efficient or effective to have one person decide, or a small group of people, or is there more of a representative way? And even that, even if you gave, like if you had an online thing where you just say, I'm putting one tick into the road, one tick into this, one tick into this, and then your tax money kind of just goes there. We can do that. We have the technology now. You could eliminate a huge facet of government And you could just have a regulatory body that just makes sure that you do this. Every paycheck, you're like, here, here, here. These are the places I'm going to choose for it to go.
Just a thought that came up when you mentioned Trumpism versus democracy. How about places that have absolute monarchies, places like Brunei, Dubai, that are presided over by an absolute monarch who rules over everything and is never questioned on anything? I mean, is it really that bad to live in those places? I mean, I think the people that live in them would argue otherwise. So I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I'm saying trying to fit it in with Trumpism versus democracy. I mean, it seems to work in certain circumstances where there's an authoritarian leader.
Yeah, it can work. Like, it's just, can one person have the right answer and effectively use their knowledge in a correct way? Yes, theoretically, that is definitely possible. The problem is that there is a possibility of that person being like Nero, Emperor Nero, who's like, would throw people in pits of leeches, or not eels, I guess, eels. So, in the history of humanity, how many kings or queens have been good people, like, and it just goes back to the fallibility of it goes back to this problem. Like, we need to solve the problem of the individual first before we multiply the individual. If you can't look at yourself in an accurate way and understand yourself, how can the function of consciousness, this part of it, how can that part of it, if it's questionable here, then that same thing being directed towards other people, it's not going to be good. If I don't know how to tie my own shoes, how can I tie other people's shoes? Doesn't make sense. So it's not that it can't work. And Plato in the Statesman, talks about this, that if you have the captain of a ship, Statements is one of his dialogues, and the captain has to leave the ship for a few minutes, right? And he writes down a list of things for you to do while he's gone. It's like, okay, just so you don't forget, this is what I don't want you to, and this is what you got to do, right? And then so there's, you got the boat, right? And it's docked on some shore, and the captain's like, I got to go over here, deal with some shit, right? Whoever that is. And then the people on the boat, they're here, and they have this list of things that they're doing. And the list is in some ways takes the place of the captain while they're gone, right? However, it would be better just if the captain was there. The captain would just do it, right? You wouldn't have to worry about interpreting the list correctly. Someone changes something on it. Like, all these other issues of the substitute of the captain wouldn't be a problem. And Plato's discussion is that this is what our laws are in society. Like, the policies and laws that we have, in some ways, is a placeholder for someone that really just knows what to do. Plato doesn't believe that democracy is the best form of government. What you're identifying, he would actually agree that a leader that has full control over everything, that is the philosopher king, is really what he's trying to get at. And in some ways, there's going to be some yelling from this side of the philosophers. That's what I want you guys to become. Everyone that's part of this group, the goal is for you to become your own philosopher king, right? And that is, in the Republic, when Plato talks about the guardians of the city, the best guardians of the city are the philosophers. And the best philosophers, every philosopher would become the best ruler of the city because they understand what's important. Yeah.
Well, isn't that where the Greek word, this word stems from the Greek aristocracy comes from, which is ruled by the most able, or the best in the society. I'm just going back to the absolute monarchy and that sort of thing. However, on the reverse side, it could be problematic because if you are, on a ship and the leadership was according to rank in terms of social status. When the captain dies and then they need somebody to take over the ship, do you choose the highest born person on the ship or the most able person on the ship to bring them to safety? So in a way it does make sense, but it also in certain situations I don't think it would work.
Yeah, well, this is like political philosophy. There's a bunch of problems that can occur, right?
Hence
And-
constitutional monarchies, where they go from absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, where the pre-existing royal family or whatever lineage it is are there to be decorative. However, the country is run by people who have been educated on running a country, as opposed to just the eldest son of the reigning monarch.
And now bring in Trumpism, where and the same thing happened when Hitler got elected and then, almost destroyed the world. Really what's going on is there's just this like endless cycle, and like that's, I guess you can see the quote that history repeats itself. And so how do we not repeat it? And in some ways, this is like I am trying to write a republic like Plato, but not only write that, but create the organization on top of whatever I've written or conceived. And that gives the individual the autonomy. Like realistically speaking, you would want it to be the case where this one book, you could give it to any fully functioning person, and that's all they would need. And they can start the whole thing from scratch. Like let's say that book was buried for 2,000 years, and then they found it, and they're like, what the hell? This is like perfectly explained, and everything has been covered. That's the goal, really. Like I only have so much time left, assuming that technology doesn't like let us live for another 200 years, which is totally cool, or longer. Yeah. So okay. So this is basically the fundamental problem. Yes.
So if you would like to talk about if you see that it's maybe a fit to the conversation now. Otherwise, we can talk about this some other time later, or perhaps me and you. How the ideas that you have. What are the similarities and what are the perhaps differences with the ideas of Plato, the Republic? If you would like to touch on this.
Yeah, for sure. Like Plato in book 1 talks about power, and justice, and like one of the arguments is
anyway, very good memory, like all these topics.
Sure.
Great. Awesome.
Thank you. And he's like, paraphrasing, like, does the person with the most power, like, does their will bring about justice, for example? Like if I have a lot of power and my might, does might equal right in some ways? So is Putin correct because he can just go like this? And then, like the epitome of arrogance and, the justification for all assholes, what I mean? And then the answer is no. And so there's a discussion of justice. And then in book 2, it's the beginning of to understand what justice is. He gives an analogy. And justice in the person, he's like, well, let's look at the city. And if we can understand what justice would be in a large group, then we can go back, and that's what justice would be in the person. And there's 3 components that make it up: wisdom, temperance, courage, and the balance of those things is justice. And so we need all 3 of those things in a city to have a healthy city, and therefore all 3 of those things to have a healthy person, right? And he kind of explains each of them. There's the guardians, that's the courage part. There's like the marketplace, that's like the temperance. There's like the philosopher, which is like the wisdom. And then the ruler in some ways is supposed to be the person that brings it all together, as you could say, or the philosopher kind of. And so, yeah, and then he kind of goes through specific details. And then he talks about enlightenment in book 7 with the allegory of the cave, which is one of the most famous parts of the Republic. And kind of just discusses, like, he goes through different conceptualizations. Like in the beginning in book 2, he says you can have 2 cities. You can have one city that's not focused on extravagance, where people just kind of get what they need and there's a certain degree of balance and things will be good. Or you can have the city where like it's capitalistic and you can just like, you can have very expensive things and it's going to create imbalance, right?
Very quickly, you mentioned wisdom, temperance, and courage. It just reminded me talking about physical, emotional, and mental. Courage could be something physical. Temperance, it looks like being able to manage emotions, the height of emotion, and wisdom is the height of mind. So it's like the height of physicality, the height of emotion, the height of mind.
That's great.
And
then justice would just be right here.
In the middle, yeah. Makes sense.
So what I'm doing is not even close to being really done yet, the way that I conceive it, because I conceive it in like a very like hierarchical, systematic way. And so this part is like this part right here. And then I'm identifying certain issues that are like at different points. There's different nodes of the issue, but the whole like systematic conceptualization, it's challenging for me, for my brain or my mind to truly get around it. Part of it is because my own life gets in the way. Because for me to like, this is like, how did I figure this out or how did I learn this? I have to like live in here somewhere. It's fucking weird. And I have to like find my place. Like there's this, which is people call me an idealist, where you're all in your head. And then there's like reality, you know, down here. And like the economy and all these other things. And so I have to kind of like bridge the gap between the two. And that's taken, you know, I don't know what to say. So this is good practice because I'm able to talk about specific parts and then get closer to putting it together. But fundamentally for me to that book or that, the book is really just like an explanation that is in text form, you know, but it would start here and then telescope out. You can flip it, doesn't really matter. But this is one of the core founding properties of it. It's the nature of consciousness. Right? Like this is made for humans, really. It's not like the first journal I ever wrote, it was called Harmony for Humans a long time ago. and this is what it was based on. You know, it's a nice little blue book. That's the idea. And so it's fun, the very core common denominator and all of these problems, what is it? What is the one thing that is in all of this? It's on the board. It's consciousness. Everything on here can always be related back to consciousness. Right? And so that is, if you're talking about like a function, you know, you want to have something that is relatable on both sides of the function, which would be consciousness. So you could write it f of x equals thing, and there'd be a c on either side. So if c equals c, then it's just the same as that. And the consciousness is not the same for everybody, like, you know, at like a neurological level and a phenomenological level. Like my perspective of the world can vary at different times and in different states. And then different people will have different levels of consciousness. You know, like if you're like, and then when I talk about this, I'm talking about it from the perspective of cognitive capacity. Whenever I say that I say that instead of intelligence or instead of learning disability, right? Because there's negative connotations with that. So what I do is I'm like, I'm just going to give you a new term that people have limitations, you know, and that's just the nature of the situation here. But from a functional level, it is still consciousness. We could take C over here and we could like have another function that explains these different components of consciousness, right? And then C would have some value, okay? But this placeholder of C is still the same. And it's more about the placeholder, right, than anything else. And so, okay, so if someone's in a vegetative state, then this wouldn't exist. They're not like, their consciousness is really there, right? Or if you get like prefrontal cortex damage, you're probably going to die. You know, depending on like if it really knocks out your consciousness, like how much damage can you take? Like if you take consciousness out of the human being, are you still human? You know? Well, kind of. You know, at what point are you not human? Like, and then we can talk about the definition of life, you know, like heartbeat, brain activity, you know, what degree of brain activity. So when I say consciousness, from a phenomenological level, like your first person perspective, like you can see a kid here, right? You're like, hey, what's that guy? But I see you sitting, chilling out, right? There's that. There's your perspective of the world, which from your perspective, if you're colorblind, like if this all looks brown to you, even though it's like magenta or something, the information, like what the thing is still the same. It's just that the presentation to you is going to be different, right? So from a phenomenological level, there are certain properties that really won't change. If you don't perceive it at all, then the consciousness is not even processing it. It didn't even go in the meat grinder. You know what I mean? There are going to be different takes or perspectives on whatever it is, and that can vary to some degree. Like if someone's just blind, well then like their brain is not registering the photons. It's not registering the color itself in the same way that it would be if we were. So what we do is we take fundamentally, like when we talk about mental health, that's like over here. The thesis relates to mental health with the assumption that if you do have a certain capacity of consciousness or a cognitive capacity, then you can figure out your depression. That's where I stand. The Thomas Sayers kind of lifestyle kind of thing, right? You know, like how can we figure out your the psychosis of your narcissism, you know, or the substance use disorder? Now, something like substance use is challenging because at a certain level, it affects the brain. Like there's brain damage, like with prolonged alcoholism, you know, the brain like looks like a shriveled lemon. It's gross. That's actually what happens, you know? Or like, you know, if you're doing crack or meth or whatever, like it's going to affect you, you know? And so there's a certain like limitation to your ability to, like from a phenomenological perspective, how are you going to navigate it if you start to close the window of decision making? You know, if you can't even perceive, like if you lose your autonomy, you lose your capacity for self-control. Now you don't even have like a controller to play the game with, you know? And so from a social level, that's why we make certain drugs just illegal, you could say. That's one I could give that justification for why it's not a good thing for people to have endless access to things, right, in society. Again, there's other, you know, there's harm reduction. I get that. And I am pro, I think drugs should just be legal, but there should be a harm reduction methodology implemented. But it's just better to not do certain drugs like opiates or meth or crack. Yeah, so this is really where I'm going at. And so going with the previous discussion from 2 weeks ago, right, we have the monkey people. This is my monkey person. Okay, I don't even know. And then, you know, they develop to be able to have like tools, and then that develops into like, you know, like rockets, that kind of a thing. And so fundamentally what's going on at this level is the conscious being is interacting with its environment. And its intelligence has produced a means to interact with the environment, like the laptop. It's been made out of materials. It helps me do certain things as a tool. And that's been our trajectory for some time now. And then you have this like AI thing, which is just a copy of the existing being's processing power, but like exponentially, and it's autonomous. That's like the whole purpose of it in some ways. Like, I don't know, we can talk about the autonomy part. You know, how reined in is the AI? It can be intelligent, but is it its own unit? You know, or is there a leash to it? And there's problems with that. So what I'm saying is that if we don't solve these problems, I'm trying to say first I'm saying there's a problem. The prolegomena. There's something that exists. There is a fire over there in the forest, and it's coming this way, right? To where our village is. So we need to pack up our shit and go over there. right? As a solution. We can't put the fire out. We got to do something. This fire is within us. And it's not like a physical thing. It's just the way our structure is made, right? It's like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You know, the only way to fix that is to like first put a scaffolding, go underneath and dig out all the ground that sucks, and then reinforce it and then lift it back up. And then, you know, and make sure it never falls over again so all the foundation is good. The way we've evolved has been good because we've been able to deal with our environment, which includes like the big saber-toothed tiger that's coming to get you, right? Wow. That's or anything that has been a danger to our species. Yeah. And the development of consciousness to this degree has helped us get to this point. But the problem is that with the individual, there's issues. We talked about that. Our relationship with others at a social level, there's problems here, right? And then, you know, you talk about AI, and that's a whole other discussion. But if we don't solve these problems here, the more what we've learned is that, like in the 80s, Cold War was the fact that now we have the power to destroy ourselves quite easily. Politically, if we can't regulate our own biases and the way we see things in ourselves and our relationship with others, you know, it's just like a game of Russian roulette. Eventually, what does it take? Like they were shelling the nuclear facility in Ukraine. You know what I mean? Like maybe they calculated where these shells were going so that it wouldn't cause a chain reaction and a nuclear explosion, but it's not a good idea. And so for us to, and even if we solve problems today, the seed of the issue is here. We really want to deal with where the problem is coming from. And that's just the structure of the human condition. And so it's not like I'm saying we need to go in and change the brain of every single human being, like through surgery. What I'm saying is that we need to use education and training to teach ourselves the skills to be comfortable with ourselves with well-being and then to get along together. That's fundamentally what it is. And the problem is the same, you know, like with the self and with the other. And the solution to that is what I've been talking about the whole time, right? Did I respond to the question? That was much more clear.
Yeah, so yeah, that was much more clear. Thank you.
Because I had anxiety. I was like, oh, this video is going to be published now, and I'm going to look like an ignorant idiot, you know? But you have to watch the videos in series. This is the goal, you know? It's just not one isolated thing. It's the collection. Because part of it is like in the thought experiment process of me doing this, right? It's like I'll think of an idea and I'll come to a point, and then we need to like continue that idea to the next point, you know? And so you can't just stop here, because generally when people write things or they put a video out, they're like, this is the right answer, because they don't want to be criticized if they made a mistake. But the problem is that A, limits your creativity, and B, will limit your problem solving, because problem solving is an iterative process. It's like I'm approaching it and I'm dealing with it in different ways. And so a big thing about this is like I'm thinking about all the philosophy students that have like a fuck you attitude towards me. They're like, wow, no, Achilles. And they don't really have an argument, really. Like, and I welcome any argument that can say why this is wrong or needs improvement. And so and those ideas that come from that way, or just the university, the structure of this institution, right? How it's built upon the things we've talked about. And really the treatment of philosophy in general. What I'm really arguing against is like all people that think that philosophy is correct in its trajectory. I'm like, no, that's not what it is. Philosophy's job is to solve this problem. Really, that's what I would say. That's the most wise thing, is to create, like, how you could say harm. That's cute, eh? Harmony for humans. That's not what I was trying to go for. But that's really what I would say wisdom is the best thing. It's wisdom for what? Intrinsic wisdom? What the hell does that even mean? Wisdom is necessary because we're human and we live in a finite existence. You know, that's just what it is to be human. And so reasoning and beliefs and truth and philosophy is to that end. It is for the purpose of figuring our own shit out, you know? And so what shit is there to figure out? Well, there's a bunch of stuff, right? I'm getting a sense that, is it time for you?
It's time for us.
It is time. Yeah, so, okay, any final thoughts? Sometimes James is overwhelmed. Just
Always.
like your brain is splattered on the wall there. That's good though.
It's very good, yeah.
Like,
That's why I come.
that's good. I need a week to put it all back together. Like I said, oh, it's just.
I'll have a eureka moment like in the middle of the night, and I'll go, "Oh, I wish I said that when you do that."
See, that's
what
what
connect. Something will connect later on, right? It's like I try to get all the information, but then it makes sense to me more as time passes.
Have you guys checked out the videos online at all?
I haven't.
Do you know about them?
You mentioned them, but I'll check them out.
You're like one of the star. Like you're like a co-star.
Really? Okay.
Well, yes. I'm not going to say no, for sure. You know, same with you.
Thank you. I
They're-
appreciate it.
They're there though for you guys. Like you can show other people.
I'll check it out.
You know, if you want, if there's one that you like a lot, like that one about the philosophy of business and capitalism. One of the students saw it and they're like, "I love this." They're like, "When are you meeting?" And so more students may be coming. I was teaching under a tree on the rocks the other day. It was awesome. It felt so like I don't know if surreal is the correct term, but it had that cliche like, you know, thing to it. It was good. It was a moment for me. You know? Yeah, I'm not sure what we'll talk about next week, but I think that I went through the territory a bit better and made it more clear. Because the current anthropological projection of just humans developing technology, but to what end? You know, because then that technology is coming from a place of madness. Then what? You know, like then what are you going to do? Or if you haven't learned how to deal with other people and there's just still starvation and fucking other problems, right? So yeah, that's why I think that the Philosophy Society, a group of people that focus on practicing these things, is important. This seminar, as a part of the overall program, is really just the reason why the program exists. You know, but if what we would really do is we would have like concrete workshops. You know, like I said, with the bystander effect. Then we would go out in the street, and you would just kind of wait for something to happen. And then you would do something, and we would say, what skills can we work on to practice taking action? And then you want to train your brain from like a behavioral perspective to like act, right? Like a firefighter preparing for a fire. Like when you hear the siren, the guys get ready, they go down the pole and they jump in the truck and they go over there and do that. We want humans to be able to respond, you know, to things in the world in a way that's safe for them, obviously. Okay, that's good. Okay. All right.